4 seats. That's the number standing between Democrats and control of the United States Senate. 4 seats out of a chamber where Republicans currently hold a 53-47 majority, and just a few months ago, getting those 4 seats looked genuinely impossible. Republicans were defending mostly red territory. Democrats had their own vulnerabilities to manage, and the math just didn't seem to add up. But that is not the map we're looking at today. North Carolina has moved toward Democrats. Alaska has become a legitimate battleground. Sherrod Brown is mounting a comeback in a state that's shifted hard to the right. And in Texas, a state Republicans have controlled at the Senate level for decades. The race has turned into one of the most fascinating political contests anywhere in the country. Today, I'm setting the polls aside entirely and giving you my own personal complete prediction for every single Senate race. No hedging, no hiding behind the averages. This is where I actually think every race ends up on election night. And I'll tell you right now, I have several Republican-held seats flipping blue, including one prediction that I already know is going to generate some serious debate in the comments. Let's get into it. We start with the foundation, the states nobody's seriously contesting. Safe Democratic, Oregon, Colorado, New Mexico, Illinois, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, New Jersey, Delaware, and Virginia. Mark Warner is a strong incumbent in a state that still gives Democrats a clear structural advantage in federal elections. Republicans can keep the margin respectable, but there's no realistic path to defeating him. Virginia goes in the safe blue column. Safe Republican, Idaho, Wyoming, South Dakota, Kansas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, Kentucky, West Virginia, and South Carolina. Yes, South Carolina, even with the passing of Lindsey Graham, stays safe red in this projection. There may be some interesting developments in the nominating process, but none of these states give me a serious reason to predict a flip. Now we move into the likely category, where things start to get a little more interesting. By the way, please leave your questions or comments in the comment section. I will answer each one individually as time permits. Also, I would be very happy if you liked the video and subscribe to my channel. Now let's continue. Minnesota is likely Democratic. Tina Smith's retirement created an open seat, which naturally gives Republicans more of an opening than they'd have against a sitting incumbent. But Minnesota still has a meaningful Democratic lean in federal races, and the party's statewide infrastructure, particularly around the Twin Cities, is strong enough to hold. The race may tighten, but I still expect a Democratic hold. New Hampshire is also likely Democratic. Jeanne Shaheen's retirement looks like a real Republican opportunity at first glance. Open seats are always less predictable, but Democrats still have the stronger baseline here. Republicans would need this race to move clearly in their direction before I'd even consider calling it a true toss-up. It hasn't moved that far. New Hampshire stays likely blue. On the Republican side, Florida is likely red. Ashley Moody is running in a state that's changed dramatically over the past several cycles. This isn't the 50-50 Florida of a decade ago. Republicans now begin statewide races with a substantially stronger foundation, and I don't think Democrats can overcome that gap even in a favorable midterm environment. Florida stays red. Montana is also likely Republican. It's an open seat, which introduces uncertainty, but the underlying Republican lean of the state is just too significant for Democrats to overcome. Outperforming the national party there is not the same thing as winning. Montana stays in the likely red column. Now, before we get to the major battlegrounds, Nebraska deserves its own conversation because it doesn't fit cleanly into any standard category. I have Nebraska as tilt Republican. And honestly, this race is far more competitive than the presidential map would suggest. Dan Osborne is running again as an independent against Republican incumbent Pete Ricketts. And after his performance in 2024, nobody can dismiss him as a protest candidate. His biggest advantage is the thing that sounds simple but matters enormously in a state like this. He's not running as a Democrat. That means he can consolidate much of the anti-Republican vote without carrying a partisan label that would normally suffocate a candidate in Nebraska. He can speak to working-class voters who would never pull the lever for a traditional Democratic nominee. That gives him a genuine path, but I still think Ricketts survives. Republicans understand the threat this time around, and Nebraska's deeply Republican lean in federal races is a real structural hurdle. Osborne comes surprisingly close, but by a narrow margin, Nebraska tilts red. Now we get into the races that actually decide the Senate majority, the lean states. Georgia leans Democratic, and I have Jon Ossoff holding his seat against Republican Mike Collins. Georgia is still one of the closest states in the country. Trump carried it in 2024 so Ossoff cannot treat this as a comfortable re-election. But I think he has a meaningful advantage. He's built one of the strongest statewide organizations and fundraising operations in the country, and he doesn't need Georgia to become a reliably blue state. He only needs to reassemble enough of the coalition that has already elected Democrats statewide multiple times in recent years. Collins will keep this race tight, but I trust Ossoff's position more right now. Georgia leans blue. North Carolina is my first Republican-held seat flipping to the Democrats. I'm predicting Roy Cooper wins. I know what you're thinking. Democrats have been competitive in North Carolina for years, and Republicans keep finding ways to win. So why am I picking Cooper? Because he isn't a normal Democratic candidate. He's already won statewide twice now as governor in a state where Republicans remain dominant at the federal level. He has proven he can win voters who don't automatically support Democrats when they look at the top of the ticket. That's the thing that makes this race genuinely different from a typical Democratic challenge in North Carolina. Michael Whatley will hold the Republican base together, and the state still leans slightly right in presidential elections. But Cooper has already demonstrated he can survive that exact environment. I think he does it again. North Carolina flips to lean Democratic. Iowa leans Republican, and this one is tougher to call than I initially expected. Joni Ernst's retirement gave Democrats a real opening, and the race has gotten genuinely competitive. The problem for Democrats is straightforward. Iowa has moved significantly to the right in federal elections over the past decade. That doesn't make a Democratic win impossible. In a strong enough national environment, they absolutely can compete here. But when I'm making a prediction, I have to separate what's possible from what I actually expect. The Republican baseline in Iowa is still stronger. My prediction is a narrow GOP hold. Iowa leans red. Maine has become one of the hardest races on the entire map to call, and the Democratic nominee situation has only made it more complicated. Susan Collins has spent her entire career doing something very few Republicans can pull off, winning in territory that fundamentally favors Democrats. Her crossover appeal is why I've never been comfortable treating Maine as a straightforward Democratic pickup, even in favorable environments. Now, with Graham Plattner having officially dropped out after rape accusations became public, Democrats have only days to select a new nominee through a delegate convention. That kind of rushed, chaotic nominating process creates real uncertainty about candidate quality and general election preparation time. Given these circumstances, I think Collins survives. Maine leans Republican in this projection. Now we arrive at the four hardest calls on this entire map. These are the races I genuinely wrestled with: Michigan, Alaska, Ohio, and Texas. Michigan first. Gary Peters' retirement opened up a genuinely 50-50 seat in one of the most evenly divided states in America. Trump narrowly carried Michigan in 2024. But Democrats have continued to show they can win statewide, even when the presidential race moves against them. Republicans have a strong candidate in Mike Rogers, who came within 0.3 points of flipping Michigan's other Senate seat in 2024, a result that surprised almost everyone. Democrats still have uncertainty on their side with their nominee, but ultimately, I think the broader midterm environment gives Democrats just enough room to hold on. Michigan stays blue, barely. Tilt Democratic. Alaska is where my map gets genuinely aggressive. I'm predicting Mary Peltola defeats Dan Sullivan. Yes, I know. Alaska is a Republican state. Trump won it by over 13 points in 2024. But here's the thing. Peltola is not a normal Democrat. She's already won statewide under Alaska's ranked choice voting system by building a coalition that includes independents, Alaska Native communities, and moderate Republicans willing to cross party lines. Her political identity reads as far more independent than the national Democratic brand, and that matters enormously in a state that occasionally elects independents but rarely elects Democrats. Sullivan is still a strong incumbent, and Alaska's Republican lean gives him a real structural advantage. But I think Peltola is one of the very few Democrats in the country capable of overcoming it. By an extremely narrow margin, Alaska flips blue. Tilt Democratic. Ohio, John Husted versus Sherrod Brown. On the surface, this should be a clean Republican hold. Ohio has moved sharply rightward in presidential politics. Trump carried it 3 times, and the state's structural lean toward Republicans is very real. But Sherrod Brown changes the calculation in a way that almost no other Democratic candidate could. He spent years building a political brand around working-class issues that cuts across the normal partisan divide, and he has a long history of running well ahead of other Democrats in Ohio. That doesn't make him an automatic favorite. Husted is the sitting senator and the environment has to cooperate. But this is a midterm election. And if the national mood continues moving toward Democrats, Brown doesn't need to turn Ohio back into a blue state. He only needs to outperform the Democratic baseline by enough to win an extremely close race. And I think he pulls it off. By less than a point, Ohio flips blue, tilt Democratic. And then there's Texas, my boldest call of the entire video. I'm predicting James Tallarico defeats Ken Paxton. I already know what the reaction is going to be. Democrats have been talking about flipping Texas for years. Every cycle, the suburbs are changing. Every cycle, the race is getting closer. And every cycle, Republicans still win. So why do I think this time ends differently? Start with the matchup. Paxton is not a generic Republican candidate. He is one of the most polarizing political figures in the state, carrying a long history of scandal, securities fraud allegations, affair accusations, and a bribery charge serious enough to trigger an impeachment vote from a Republican-controlled state house. None of that destroys him with the Republican base. But this race won't be decided solely by the Republican base. It will be decided in the suburbs of Dallas and Houston, the exact places where a polarizing nominee creates real defection risk. Then look at Tallarico. He's one of the strongest Democratic candidates Texas has produced in years, a gifted communicator who doesn't come across as a Washington-manufactured product. His political style gives him a real shot at reaching voters who genuinely dislike Paxton, but wouldn't normally consider pulling the lever for a Democrat. The path is still incredibly difficult. Texas has a powerful Republican statewide infrastructure and decades of history working against this outcome. But predictions aren't supposed to be a list of safe choices. Sometimes you have to look at a matchup and decide when a state is actually ready to break. I think 2026 is that moment. A favorable midterm environment creates the opening. Paxton's vulnerabilities create the target, and Tallarico is the candidate who finally takes advantage of it. By the narrowest margin of any race on my map, Texas flips blue, tilt Democratic. So here's the final picture. Democrats hold Georgia and Michigan. They flip North Carolina, Alaska, Ohio, and Texas. Republicans survive in Iowa, Maine, and Nebraska. That gives Democrats exactly the 4-seat net gain they need to take control of the United States Senate. My final prediction, Democrats win 51 seats, Republicans finish with 49, and the Democrats take back the majority heading into the second half of Trump's term. And here's what I want to be clear about. This is not a prediction built on a massive Democratic wave where every close race falls blue by default. Republicans win hard fights in Nebraska, Iowa, and Maine. But I do think the environment has shifted enough, and the Republican nominee in a critical state is weak enough to create real pickup opportunities that weren't on the board a year ago. The entire majority could realistically come down to one race. Maybe Alaska holds for Sullivan, maybe Brown falls just short in Ohio, or maybe Texas actually becomes the race that shocks the entire country on election night. But as of right now, that's my call. Democrats take the Senate 51-49. Tell me what you think in the comments. Which prediction do you disagree with the most? And I want the honest answer. Am I completely out of my mind for flipping Texas, or is 2026 actually the year it finally happens? Drop it below. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.